Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Leaders and Friends. I'm honored today to have a great friend of mine, Geoff Beattie, on with us. Geoff was a GE director for a long time. He's been a director of Baker Hughes, of Royal Bank of Canada. He started two investment funds. He's one of the really best known Canadian executives of certainly my generation, and just a fantastic guy. So, Geoff, it's great to see you again, and thanks for doing this.
Oh, look, Geoff, it's my pleasure and great to see you.
Yeah. So let's just start, Geoff, with kind of what you're doing today. You're building another investment company called Generation Capital. Talk about kind of the world of investing and what you're trying to build there in Canada.
Yeah, no, great. Yeah, Generation Capital, there was a temptation to think of this as a bit of a family office or a family business because it's an outcrop of the work that I obviously did in most part of my career with the Thompson family. But after leaving Woodbridge in 2012, 13, and that was part of a natural sort of succession plan to the family. Uh, I started thinking about what I wanted to do with sort of my career and next. And I really wanted to start something on my own and start something that I could run and sort of be in charge of and put the teams together. And that was a great plan for a few years. And then I realized that, my capital base wasn't going to let me play to my strengths. So I sort of teamed up with one of the families I'd worked with throughout my time at Woodbridge. And we sat down and talked about what it really means to look after, as hokey as it sounds, sort of generational capital. And I was going to, own the business, and they were going to have the base of capital, and we were going to
Mhm.
decide what sort of configuration made the most sense to run that. And we just went through our first 10 years, and yeah, it's been very successful.
That's great, Geoff. So what interests you in terms of like private equity, venture equities? How do you think about where
Yeah.
to invest, particularly in an environment like today where it's so volatile?
Well, I felt it at the time, and I feel more strongly even in hindsight that first thing you need to do when you sit down is determine what type of capital you have, and what is your purpose? What's your purpose of looking after that capital? You know, uh, family offices. I've often said to people when they say, tell me a bit about your view on family offices. I say, family office is a term of art. Sometimes it's the dusty old office at the end of the corridor of the operating business where the retired CFO sort of looks after everybody. And other times you see what Michael Dell and people like that have done, and they effectively institutionalize it. But if you dig through it, you got to decide what type of capital is it, and what are you trying to achieve. So in this case, we have fully taxable capital. It
Mhm.
is generational capital. It's not the liquidity in which the family lives off of day to day. And we begin to design, what's the best investment strategy. And the thing that really popped up is the fact that investing the money is really only a portion of the services you provide. Investment returns, kind of went through a go-go era where everybody got the focus around that, and everybody decided if they could get a hold of people's capital, they could run off and do something
Mhm.
exceptional. But what we've done is said, how do we look after the capital that we've worked hard to build all those years and make sure we're growing it in the context of what the family wants?
Mhm.
And that applied to my family as well as the family I'm working with. And so we started thinking about risk management a bit. We started thinking about, tax. We started thinking about, how we were going to store that wealth over time, what type of asset classes, where does currency come into play on this? Where does, geographical issues come into play if we were building a 20-year strategy of looking after the capital that had been built? So
Mhm.
today we've got, 25 people working here. about a third of them are involved in the actual investment process. And we run what you would think of as an asset allocation model. We have a bias towards global growth equity because we think that's where we're going to see the best opportunities to, deliver on that, program over the next 20 years. We think that's going to act in our favor. We have a very positive bias towards, that the world's going to become a better place that's going to deliver prosperity over 20 years. We also are completely aligned with the thinking that, some not so good things are going to happen along the way, and but we think on balance, more good things are going to happen. We don't know which order those things are going to come about, so we're, that's why we advantage ourselves over a long time frame, so we can play through both of those things and build a portfolio that can, sustain, stay in the game, and take advantage of the long-term trend.
How are you viewing, the big buzzword right now is AI and the impact it's going to have, both in terms of creating new companies and impacting old companies. How do you think about that as an investor right now?
We tend to frame it, pretty carefully in the sense that, if we use an analog model like the Industrial Revolution, both in terms of the timeframes, the impact, the ups and downs, we are big believers and have been since the middle to late 90s that we're in a technology revolution, and so we're framing our investment activities against that, and we continue to analyze it that way. And I would say our success over the last 20 years is equally attributable to what we haven't done as opposed to what we have done. We have leaned into a long-term trend that is being driven by a technology revolution, and we've leaned away from asset classes and things that we don't think are going to be the place to be during that period of time. And you can imagine what those industries are, and that's played out. You look at the dominance of the S&P 500. You look at the dominance of GDP growth. You look at the dominance. You look at the Canadian economy today. And I use it as a bit of a proxy for the U.S. economy because we share some of the same attributes. But 70% of our GDP is in services. Right. And we sit around and talk about the fact that we haven't exploited, some of our natural gifts in this country the way I wish we had. But, there's reasons for that just because of what technology is doing to change where value is.
Yeah. You've been, again, you were a great board member at GE. You were the lead director at Baker Hughes and Royal Bank of Canada, things like that. Give me your perspectives on, I guess, two things. One is, what do you look for in good leaders, right? How would you like to see leadership and leaders develop inside a company? And the second one is, as a board member, how do you try to drive strategic advantage for companies and the proper, I guess, oversight over companies? So you can take those and both you could write a PhD on either one, but
Exactly.
you're uniquely positioned in both.
Well, obviously my views on all this are heavily influenced by my experience. So I do kind of go back from time to time and try to think about it. I'm a big believer that leaders are trained. It's not an innate skill. And the training of leaders, it's not a textbook type training. It's circumstantial. Leaders get trained in the military differently than leaders get trained in business, and they get trained differently in the community, and they get trained differently in government, etc. So you never want to fall for the mistake that, there's this thing called a leader and you can plug and play them in any set of circumstances you want. So we've thought, a lot about that. I think about, I'll use a board of directors as a template to talk about leadership. You know, what I've found has happened over the last 20 years is that anything that's got the name public in front of it has gone a little bit from, too much I and not enough we, right? And that's public boards, that's, public policy, that's governments, and if you analyze the breakdown of why we don't like what's going on in our political systems and things like that, is people are trying to accommodate individual needs to have, their views heard or their expressions heard. And if you're not willing to accommodate that, then you become the enemy. You're no longer you're no longer a listener and a facilitator of good ideas. And the best boards, as you know, and you experienced them, is that when people realize first and foremost what their job is, and their job's not to help management run the company. Their job is to provide a governance regulator over a business, and it's to oversee that what I like to think of, three major things, right? Do you have the right people doing the job that you think you're doing? Do you have the right strategy, i.e., that those people developed a strategy that's going to get you to where you want to go? And are you stewarding the capital in a way that's consistent with that? And to me, if a board comes together and stays very, very focused on those type of activities, they can be very effective. But as you well know, and I think one of the great downfalls of board governance was after the great financial crisis, when the powers that be decided that boards needed to recruit for skill set, and the skill set that really never made the list was, is this person a good board member?
Yeah.
People wanted to go out and get washed up marketers or retired risk managers and things like that, and say, we need you on the board. So and I actually found circumstances where people were being put on boards and for areas of expertise that weren't as skilled or as thoughtful as the people that were working at the company doing the job full time. And as a result, you started to get, more and more sense that, boards were, not there to do the role that I just described as much as being helpers.
Yeah.
I used to always think,
Geoff, I'm on board, a few public and private boards, and I find that governance as ascribed by ISS or others has almost nothing to do anymore with running a good company. And when you're in the game, you can't complain about the refs, but I hope somebody's, someday kind of gets it back on track, because it's just not right now.
well, look, if you stress test what's been successful over the last 20 years, is the best and the brightest people moved away from public to private.
Yeah.
Private equity got away from the public model of governance. Our best and most talented people that we would hope go into government went into private sector agencies and stayed away. And public has become a bit of a euphemism now for playing out on social media, as opposed to actually a skill set that brings the we together rather than the I all day long. And I just think that people don't think we're paying the price in some of these sort of board situations. They sort of see it as an era that we're going through. But I see it all day long. I see it. No longer are young people aspiring to some of these top roles, because they don't it's not what they want anymore. And so some of the best people are migrating away from these big important companies. We've sort of trained the world on these magnificent seven companies that they can exist without governance, and they don't have to play by the board rule. So they're success by exception. And so I think we're a bit of a messed up thing. And unfortunately, to a large extent, I think great US companies have learned to function kind of without their board. And the ones that, aren't functioning with that, it's become an alternative employment stream for people that, are no longer, fighting it out on the front lines all day long.
No, I laugh.
I joke, Geoff, and it's I always say, and I'm very careful around here because I've obviously got a lot of colleagues that I'd still love to work with and things like that, and they've retired and things, and they were sort of saying they'd like to maybe there's a spot here where we'll have like an advisory board, or I'm always interested in hearing other people's views. And I always use the analogy. I said, when I was in the heat of the battle, the first time I was the CEO, I honestly loved to get information and learn from people, but never once did I say, I just wish there was the old guy who used to do my job down the hall so I could go talk to him. I never said that. So I refuse to become that guy.
I tell founders and CEOs, Geoff, I say, look, on your board, you want people that don't have the time to do it and don't need the money, but are willing to. Okay. Those are good board members. The people who need the money and want to do it, those are bad board members.
Yeah.
And they look at me in a confused way, and then they come back 6 months later and say, Geoff, you were right. You were right about that after all.
Well, the biggest problem I've run into is, I know some of the people that I was lucky enough to be on Royal Bank and GE and things with. These were like titans of business who, more than anything had impeccable business judgment. And part of the reason you can't attract these people anymore is there's no room in the boardroom for them to exercise that skill.
Yeah.
Because if you do, you're seen as, being, being too much of the first among equals rather than allowing everybody to play a role, which is tough, right?
Yeah. Geoff, we're sitting here today at a day when President Trump is tweeting to your prime minister, and there's tariffs and things like that. Give me a sense for how you're looking as a one of the thought leaders in Canada. How do you think about where trade is today, and what people should be thinking about, how to view uh, the Canadian market in the global context?
Yeah, look, I start from the point that, Canada, economically and socially has been a real success story over the last 25 years. And we've, been able to, pursue strategies against the backdrop of what was going on in the world and produce a country with, as Henry Kissinger said, whatever, 40 years ago, Canada is a country in search of a problem. Perhaps we've eventually found one, but, free trade has been a mutually advantageous thing for Canada and the people that we trade with. It's not a system that doesn't require, negotiation and fixing over time. But I think, the first thing I would say is it's been successful because it's been mutually advantageous to everyone. So, the override right now of Trump saying that, we're going to destroy the Canadian economy and, then, annex it in, and somehow that's the outcome of all of this is rubbish. Look, I think all of this noise that's coming out of Washington, particularly the noise directed at Canada, no question, it's destabilizing, but it's not devastating. And nobody should think of it that way. And I would give you a bit of a contrarian view that we've been trying to address some productivity and efficiency issues in this country for several years, notwithstanding that we're doing reasonably well. And I feel pretty comfortable that some of this destabilizing rhetoric is going to be the provocation that forces us to deal with some of this stuff. And if I give you that in the backdrop of my belief in what's happening over the long cycles with technology and things like that, it's a real opportunity for Canada. And I hate to say the word, like we're going to suffer going through this, but we're not going to suffer the way Ukraine is going through what they're going through with their neighbor. We're going to suffer, and that we're going to have to make choices, and we're going to have to make better choices about things because some of the stuff that we had in place before allowed us to run the play too long without thinking about reinvesting in it.
Yeah, no, I think Geoff, the Canada gets miscast as a NAFTA country when it's really like a freestanding economic economically strong, innovative country, right? It's resource rich. You've got some of the best financial people in the world. You've got great services. And
Yep.
I always viewed like I could pay extra attention in Canada. We could win almost every order that was out there just by making the trip to Toronto, which
Yeah.
was pretty easy trip to make. And so I think people have a tendency to kind of like way underplay Canada. And I contrast that, Geoff, to Europe, which I think is actually in a sad position today. Like I think Europe has wasted this tremendous human capital that they have in a government that's just not, if you look at Germany, the electricity costs are 4 times the US. If you look at the top 50 tech companies by market cap in the world, none are in Germany, right? And you sit there and say, that's not working, And so I think people tend to blend all these together when each one is almost its own story to a certain extent.
And look, I mean, Canadians are quietly proud of their heritage and the history. And interesting is Canada has been a huge success story on many, many fronts. But because it hasn't been the success story that people like to compare at scale. This isn't the China experiment or the
Mhm.
U.S. experiment. But if you look at what we've done with capital spending post Second World War and the type of infrastructure and the type of capital that we have in this economy on this massive landmass with 90% of the people living within 100 miles of the US border and what was 17 18 million people, it's now 42.
Mm.
And how we benefited in our lives, our education infrastructure, our healthcare infrastructure. You just have to be very careful you don't confuse how positive that story was with some notion that it's going to go in perpetuity, regardless of whether you pay attention to it or not. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got to get back to saying, okay, as a 40 to 45 million person country with these issues in the next 50 years, where should our priorities lie? Where do we have to go? And I don't think we need to do anything dramatic. We just need to do better and constantly improve. We probably weakened our balance sheet a little bit without really seeing the results that you would expect from doing that. And so we're going to have to clean it up. And
Yeah.
I think it'll all happen. I mean, immigration has been by every measure an absolutely key part of what we've accomplished in the past and what we need to win in the future. And you get frustrated by it, and so do I. Is you can give examples of where it's not as well run as you'd like it to be, but the solution can't be, you know, to do what Trump seems to like to do, which is he doesn't want to fix the problems that we all agree are there. He wants to create his own so he can
Yeah.
solve them. And
Yeah.
that's
No,
what we got.
we
And
need,
that's where I think we're going to be okay in Canada.
yeah, I agree with that.
We've got problems to fix, and they're ours of our own making, and we will.
Yeah, I think the welcoming position of Canada is being noticed on a global scale. And I think, again, we need to make our immigration system work, but we need a system. In other words, zero doesn't work for this country
Totally. And look,
either.
I'm a big proponent of system thinking. And
Yeah.
when you have a dynamic economy and society like we do, the system is dynamic and you've got to manage it dynamically.
Yeah. I think it's, Geoff, what you talk about there again, and I won't dwell too much on this, but like, nobody likes the dynamic between President Trump and Ukraine that happened last week. But the Afghanistan-Iraq war cost $8 trillion with no positive impact. So the notion that
Yeah.
any country can afford to fight these endless wars just has to be rethought. And that's where like the old, the foreign policy school never looks in the mirror to reflect on, gosh, what should we be learning
Yeah.
as
But
as we live in this world, right? And
you'll, no one will ever convince me, though, and this seems to be the feeling that many have, is that, out of Trump's behavior comes some good thinking. Totally agree. But when it's delivered with dehumanizing behavior, like was played in the White House, that's just inexcusable from a risk point of view. I mean, we're only 2 or 3 more meetings away before Trump convinces people that the Ukrainians don't have a right to exist. And we've come a long, long way about that. And people like to talk about whether we've lost, David Brooks, who I love listening to and love everything he writes, because he is very in tune with, this sort of pulling apart of fundamental values starts with sort of a sense of sadness, but it moves quickly to a sense of meanness if we're not careful.
yeah, look, I'm a believer that good being a good person matters, right?
Yeah.
I think we just can't lose the problems that he's uncovering are big problems that need to be solved. And I think that can't be lost in all this. But let me go, Geoff, just in closing, like you've been so successful. Give us best decision you made in your career, because a lot of this goes towards to leadership. Best decision and kind of one piece of advice you'd give to any young manager about how to really build a meaningful business career.
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate it. I feel incredibly fortunate because at times like this, I do reflect on the fact that we all might have worked in one of the most remarkable periods in economic history. And if you somehow, had a strong enough mother to make sure you stay in the game and not take yourself out of the game, the last 30 or 40 years, you put a lot of points on the board. And
Mhm.
so look, I never lose sight of that. The thing that I've certainly learned, and today is sort of indicative of that, is that young people spend an overwhelming a lot of time early in their careers trying to figure out what it is they want to do. And the moment when you transition to becoming the person you truly want to be, in my experience, it's when you make the choice of who you want to do it with. And I've seen that magic. I've seen it, in places like General Electric and things like that, where you know you were able to move around and become the best version of who you were because people that you totally trusted to say follow me, you followed, right?
Mhm.
And right now, I think we see people caught in the what, whether it's going to Wall Street or going to do something else, and we worry that some of our organizations are not being emphasis is not being placed on the things you talked about: values, morals, leadership skills, and things like that. And we need to make sure that those stay strongly intact, because that's the future for everybody's success, right?
Mhm.
Working with good people. And that's what I mean about destabilizing right now. I don't think anybody is sitting there properly analyzing what the economic impacts of tariffs are. They're analyzing the fact that it's erratic behavior, and that makes people very uncomfortable.
Mhm.
So we gotta sort that out. But again, I go back to the beginning too, is that leadership is a trained skill, and we're not all going to be, leaders in everything we choose to do. But there's opportunities for everybody to grow into leadership roles. You think of some of the best leaders that worked for you. They came out of circumstances. They came out of hard work. They came out of opportunity.
Mhm.
And that's where I make sure. The other skills that I totally believe in leadership too is you have to find this type of thing fun. You need to find interacting with people something that you want to engage in, not avoid. And
Mhm.
a lot of people go into situations when they get leadership roles and think it's their right to be able to interact with people, but you've got to treat it like the way that you connect with the world, the way you connect with yourself. And that's why I say to a lot of the young people around here, you got to go to know. You can't sit behind
Mhm.
your desk and become a leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was your best decision going to law school but not becoming a lawyer?
I say to people that I couldn't imagine a better 15-year start to my career than having become a lawyer, because of all the great people I worked with, and how I learned to think about it. But I also couldn't imagine I could be that happy if I stayed with it. So the next thing, but I'll tell you the other thing too, is it never occurred to me that the thing that I might like the most and the thing that I enjoy the most is what I'm doing right now.
Yeah,
And
that's good.
I always had in the back of my mind, and I think you encouraged me at the time, is I think we all want to be a principal in our own life at some point. And I spent a great deal of my career as an agent for others, and I learned a lot, and I enjoyed it, and I built a great network. But at some point, the best decision I made is saying, let's be accountable to myself, and let's see how that works.
Yeah. Hey, Geoff, thanks for a great conversation.